Hi everyone. Welcome, welcome. If you can see and hear me, please can you put some pluses in the chat? Happy Friday, everyone. Okay. So I'm going to wait another minute or so until 4:31 in order to ensure that everyone who's dashing home after school perhaps, or trying to get a seat and get their technology sorted out and logged on, is ready to go. If you haven't had a chance already, take a look at my message in the chat, put a plus in the chat, or a morning miss, or afternoon miss, or hi Eleanor, or whatever. And also open the workbook so that you have that to annotate either on a device, to follow along with, to print out and write on. That would obviously be my preference, so that I could have all of the notes from not just the written content of the lesson, not just the workbook itself, but also all of the learning you're doing within the lesson, right? The lesson is two-part. It's the content you're given, but also the discussions that we have and the extra information that's not on the slides that you need to add as you work. How did people find the homework? It was okay for a first lesson? The video solution should have helped you if you had any questions, concerns, but if you had any lingering still, feel free to pop them in the chat as well. Okay, well, let's get started then, shall we? Today's lesson on Othello is lesson 2 in the unit. It's another lesson on context, gender, blackness, and expectation in Jacobean England. So this is crucial in order for us to get into and understand quite a lot of the discussion happening both in Othello but also around Othello. Probably the most common themes in Othello could be boiled down to jealousy, race, love, and appearance versus reality. And so you can see we're covering at least 2 of those today if we're thinking about love as falling under different kinds of love and marriage as well. I know that was a recent exam question, was love and marriage. As well as sort of people either fulfilling or subverting the expectations of what they seem to be. And Othello and Desdemona both do sort of play with identity as well, and Iago takes advantage of that. Obviously, this is also reflecting the Jacobean era and its sort of expectations, its rigid hierarchy, its context of the time, as we discussed to start with in our first lesson about the sort of racial anxieties and xenophobic anxieties of Jacobean England, which were fueled by Islamophobia, fueled by fear of the Ottoman Empire and conquest by the Spanish, somewhat fueled by racist prejudice against the Moors, who were largely moving from Spain to England, but kind of the combination of both blackness and Spanish identity really would have influenced the Jacobeans' response to them. and let's get started. Just a reminder, in case anyone missed the first lesson, I'm Eleanor. I'm one of the English teachers at my EdSpace. I've taught Key Stage 5 for about 5 years now, and I will be your teacher across this year group and across this year's units, and we'll be covering sort of the most common A-level titles. That's not to say we'll cover absolutely every possibility of A-level titles, because school by school they differ so much. But we will endeavour to support you in your 2-year course with this 1-year My EdSpace course that will supplement your knowledge and hopefully give you a bit more support and make you feel more confident. So let's get started with the do now. Question 1, what is the setting of Othello? Question 2, list at least 3 themes that appear in Shakespeare's Othello. Question 3, with what political conflicts was England engaged during the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras? And then what are some ideas associated with the colour black? Excuse me. So take a moment to pop these into the chat so that we can share and compare our answers, make sure that they are right, and then we'll review them in just a minute or two's time. You're welcome to just put these as fragments of sentences, not necessarily expecting you to write in beautiful flowing essay style full sentences at this point. This is just a review, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. So starting with this setting, and as we saw previously, there are actually 2 settings that really matter in Othello, and the interaction between them is also really interesting. Hopefully people are popping these into the chat. I'll give you another moment and then we will review. So let's get started. So the settings of Othello. One of these is Venice, which is this epicenter of culture, this kind of exoticized England that is cultured and interesting and quote unquote civilized, compared to Cyprus, which is this military outpost that's seen as kind of the end of the world. I mentioned Edward Said's Orientalism, if you've read anything about that, perhaps in your sociology course, about the kind of negotiation with Western Europe and the other in society. So Europe defining itself by what it is not, and kind of putting those expectations and that definition on the rest of the world, particularly the Middle East and Asia. So these are our 2 settings. 3 themes. I started us off with quite a few. So race, another one, jealousy, gender, love, appearance versus reality, you could keep going on here, treachery, deceit, marriage, friendship, betrayal, manipulation, any of those would work. And then the next one, with what political conflicts was England engaged during the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras? One of these was conflict with the Spanish Empire. as they both attempted to quote unquote discover and colonize sort of both the known and unknown world. And they were trying to become sort of the world leaders, but in their view they could only have the one. So it was kind of this quest for domination and ownership. There was also a conflict with the Ottoman Empire. So Spain, English people would have been particularly prejudiced against the Spanish. There would have been lots of propaganda against the Spanish, but the Ottoman Empire particularly would have incited ire because they were also not the same religion. Though Spain was Catholic and England was Protestant, and those were definitely conflict. They were definitely in conflict at the time. There was also this sort of exoticized other. And I'm using Edward Said's language here in quotes in order to talk about the fact that it was England who did this exoticizing of the Ottoman Empire. These conflicts stem back to the Crusades, for example, and again, the similar idea of colonization, being a world leader, domination in both. This was also aligned with the timing of the Age of Discovery. So the Americas were being colonized, as was South America and Central America. More parts of Asia were being colonized at the same time. So all of this was sort of in conjunction with each other. We can also talk about the monarchy here. So conflicts like the Gunpowder Plot, the succession problem, thinking of who would succeed Queen Elizabeth I as monarch. This was unclear for quite a while, as she intentionally did not declare an heir because she feared retribution and sort of an overthrowing. And then this last one, what are some ideas associated with the colour black? Now, we're thinking about the Jacobean mindset, right? So we're thinking things like evil, witchcraft, devilry, absence of God, if God is light, absence of light. This is moral darkness or moral turpitude. And so as we start to look at race, these ideas are coming to mind so that we can think about what the Jacobeans thought about this, and thus how they would impose these thoughts onto someone they witnessed as black. So just to review briefly, the Jacobean era spans the period of King James I's rule. The zeitgeist was influenced by, and you know this a little bit because this is what we started with in last lesson, a rigidly hierarchical society determined by the great chain of being. Transgressing that meant going against God's will, and thus the most terrible treason and mortal sin. A tightly controlled patriarchal society in which gender expectations determined women's submissive and subservient roles as wives and mothers, influenced by religion as well as the kind of defining woman of Christianity is Mary, the Mother of God, the Virgin Mary. So this idea of a mother who's also a bastion of chastity, and women were expected to uphold sort of her example. It was also a prejudiced society, suspicious of outsiders, as shown through their reactions to witchcraft, Spanish and the Moors, exiled from England by Elizabeth I's edicts in 1599 and 1601. the validity and the effect of those edicts, whether they're actually put into place or if they were more sort of rumours incited by people who wanted their Moors to be expelled from England out of fear of jobs being taken, is kind of debatable but unsolved by critics at this point. The Spanish Empire, threats of Spanish domination, memorably punctuated by the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, but tensions continued, especially as the Spanish hoped that England would be restored as a Catholic country, and James doubled down on that not being the case, doubled down on Protestantism as he carried into his reign. Religious turmoil, there was anti-Catholic sentiment, warring factions, conspiracies against both Elizabeth I and James I regarding the right to rule and to worship. This included a tightening over James's reign of anti-Catholic laws and ability to practice. So there's also the transatlantic slave trade. So since the 1560s, English traders had been engaged in the slave trade, not necessarily officially by order of the Queen, but people were doing this. England, such as was engaged in the slave trade. Then Queen Elizabeth I founded the Barbary Company during her reign, and also legitimised Anglo-Ottoman trade. So one of the consequences of the 1600 visit of diplomats from the Ottoman Empire to Queen Elizabeth I's court was that they agreed to a trade negotiation that included the buying and selling of enslaved people. So that was not necessarily codified as legal or illegal at the time, but it definitely was happening de facto. And then, as I said, the Age of Discovery, ideas of empire and world domination. Interestingly, in Spain, there was also this kind of hesitation and xenophobia and racism about Moors. Philip III of Spain in 1609 expelled 300,000 Moors from Spain. If you think about populations of the 1600s, that is a decent chunk of Spain's society at the time. There was suspicion of Islam and strong anti-Catholic sentiment, strong anti-Muslim sentiment, as these religions sort of fought for their religion to be recognized as the one true religion, and used ideas like the Crusades and colonization in order to enforce that. This expulsion of the Moors from Spain in 1609 came after a long history of tension between the Catholic contingent of Spain and the Moors, who were Muslim and often black. This was during the 11th to 15th centuries. Spanish Catholics fought to reconquer Spain from Islamic Arabs and Berbers or Moors who had lived there since at least the 900s. So there had been presence of black people in Europe since the 900s at the very least, but it was during this early 1600s that things really did come to a head, as people attempted to justify enslavement. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. If not, I'll keep going and talk a little bit about gender. We'll look at some gender in Othello, and then we will move to race as well. So I'm going to read this part out again and then talk a little bit about the women's role in Jacobean England, and then we'll link this to Shakespeare's Othello. So first of all, women in Jacobean England had very little agency. Their lives were determined by their fathers and later their husbands. Marriages would be arranged by father. The match would prioritise the power, wealth or influence gained rather than love between the couple. Marriage was the only way in which women gained agency, as married women were granted more freedom and status than single women. However, this agency was for the most part confined to specific feminine spheres of influence, chiefly the home. So this idea of the domestic sphere as the woman's domain and the external world as the man's domain. For example, the scenes in which Desdemona and Emilia exhibit sororal bonds, as the more experienced wife Emilia shares marital knowledge with the young Desdemona and offers advice for wives as to how to get what they want from their husbands. It is here too that Othello and Desdemona discuss their marriage without overt external influence. So it is in these kind of internal scenes that Desdemona and Emilia can speak more frankly with each other, and Emilia can speak knowledgeably as a married and established woman about how they can access power within their sphere. This can be by their feminine wiles, this can be by their control of the domestic sphere, or their knowledge of men now that they are married, because obviously women would have had no contact physically with men and very little sort of social contact with men outside of very controlled environments. Stephen, was there also misogyny? Absolutely, yes. And we're going to look at this a little bit more in a moment, but certainly, yes, there was absolutely misogyny. Women were viewed as less important than men and weaker than men as well. This is all stemming from, for example, the biblical Eve in the Genesis story of the Bible, in which Eve capitulates to the temptation of Satan, gives in, and then tempts Adam. So she is seen as the weaker of the two. Also, the fact that she was formed from Adam's rib in that story was part of the idea behind Eve's existence being dependent on Adam's existence, and her being kind of a consequence of his existence, a secondary idea. Patriarchal society, absolutely, Stephen. Yeah, for sure. In that great chain of being, women were absolutely below men. And now if we look at the second paragraph, however, marriage also made a woman and her dowry the property of her husband. Women were considered the weaker sex, who needed both physical and moral protection from their husband, a belief that stemmed from the fall of the biblical Eve. The husband was considered head of house and had to provide for his wife and their children, though husbands were responsible for chastising an erring wife, which could literally include almost parent-child punishments of taking things away from them or shutting them in the house or returning them to their father to be chastised as well. They were not allowed to be cruel or abusive. Thus, when Iago warns Othello of Desdemona's previous defiance of her father in marriage, he is reminding Othello of his responsibility for curbing a young wife's potential defiance. Yes, so this is Iago saying, well, this is your job now. She defied someone else, so you're going to have your hands full trying to ensure that she is taught about how to behave and rigidly controlled by you so that she doesn't embarrass you. And we'll get more into why they would think that she would embarrass him later. Just to return this idea of weakness for a moment, this also stems from the Greeks who believed that a man was controlled by his brain and a woman by her uterus, which they believed wandered the body and was very chemically imbalanced. So they believed that an imbalance of humours would set this womb sort of to become very volatile in the woman's reactions, and would be calmed only by the uterus being used / fulfilled by being pregnant. So the idea of women being controlled by sex and by heterosexual relationships and by having a role as a mother. Steve, you said like persuading Othello to objectify Desdemona. Yeah, definitely. He's saying, well, you know, look at what you've got here. This is trouble for you, and it is already the commencement of starting this doubt in Othello's mind, pointing at this, well, she defied her father, that must mean she's bad and weak, so be careful that she doesn't betray you as well. And then this also links to a convention called the Madonna-whore dichotomy. So the Madonna-whore dichotomy describes the idea of a woman being perceived as one of two opposite archetypes, or two opposite characters, traditional characters. The Madonna, the pure, virtuous, innocent, Mary-like caregiver. Madonna is comes from the Italian my lady. So this idea of Mary as a mother of Jesus, but also a virgin. Or a whore, a sexualized, seductive, and corrupting woman. I say corrupting because it was the same Eve-like idea of her causing the downfall of an otherwise good man. Critics can use this term to describe the duality of fantasies of femininity imposed by women by patriarchal values. So this idea of women not necessarily in real life falling into these archetypes, but rather patriarchal society defining women as either one or the other of these. The reductive nature of this binary denies women complexity or agency, as it forces them to embody only one of these archetypal figures. So this idea that you could be one or the other, you're not deciding for yourself, but rather it's being decided for you by patriarchal society and your reception in society, as well as your class and your behavior and people's perception of you. But it also is really restrictive, and it's also one way. It's the Madonna, and then if there's any transgression, etc., then they fall, using the language of biblical Eve as well, into this idea of the whore. And we can see that this is the trajectory that Desdemona takes in Othello's mind, despite being innocent. Jacobeans also believed in the pseudoscience or the fake science of physiognomy, in which a person's external appearance was determined by and reflective of their moral character. So this means that they believed that if you were beautiful, it was because you had a good character, a good moral character. And if you were ugly, it was because God was punishing you and you were far from God's beauty and God's creation. So you were morally corrupt or bad. This was also played out in lines of class, as well as the upper class people were viewed as more beautiful and literally their features as more refined, whereas working class people were viewed to have coarser features, so uglier, kind of less delicate features. Obviously a really classist thing to believe and a really problematic thing to believe, but that is something that the Jacobeans absolutely did believe in and did carry on through at least the Victorian era, and still has definitely residue of it today in the way that people treat beauty and class and external appearance and value it as something that is something other than coincidental and genetic. So part of the anxieties about appearance in Othello reflect this concern that Desdemona's external beauty and seeming purity, she's very pale, she's very innocent looking, she's very sort of blushing and young and sweet. Othello and other characters point this out, but part of the horror for Othello is that this idea might mask something adulterous and deceptive. This is one of the reasons why makeup was considered such a deceitful thing to use in this time. It was something that only sex workers, for the most part, used, or these whores of the Madonna-whore dichotomy, because it was viewed as a way of masking and deceiving someone of what your appearance looked like. And if your appearance is matching your internal beauty, then if you are masking and making yourself look more beautiful falsely, then you are also morally corrupt and not to be trusted on the inside. And if we're thinking about gender, there are these three parallel couples. There are Othello and Desdemona. Desdemona is this paragon of chastity and purity and kind of the ideal woman who is idealized by a lot of the characters, including Brabantio at the beginning, including Rodrigo, including Cassio, including Othello, obviously. There's also Iago and Emilia. Emilia is married. She is able to speak more frankly. She's more experienced, but she's also given power that Desdemona, as a new bride, doesn't necessarily have. We don't even know if Desdemona and Othello consummate their relationship. So there is clearly this kind of lack of information with Desdemona. She doesn't know her husband very well yet, which is possibly one of the reasons why she becomes kind of his perfect victim, because when he is angry at her and doing all these sort of confusing questions, she can't make sense of what he's doing, and thus unknowingly enrages him more. And that's not to put the blame on her, but it is possibly part of the explanation for why she is sort of unable to understand something about him. Whereas Emilia is much more realistic and much more critical, and speaks to Iago and speaks to the other men much more frankly and in a much more empowered way. And so these small interactions we have between Emilia and Desdemona are interesting because they develop this sororal bond between them. By that I mean sisterly bond, like sorority, sisterhood, sororal bond between them, as they kind of share this information as two women who are protected by having been married by the start of the play. And then there's Cassio and Bianca. And Bianca is a really interesting character because, first of all, her name in Italian means white. So if we're thinking about gender and class here and these ideas of purity, if she's potentially a sex worker, certainly sexually active with Cassio in the eyes of the Jacobeans, this is an ironic name, right? That she is pure and white when she's a sex worker is sort of Shakespeare playing with these ideas of chastity here. And it's interesting as well, Cassio as this gentlemanly figure who idealizes and idolizes Desdemona also engages with sex workers like Bianca. Bianca implies she's not the only one. In some sources we have that Cassio is married, in others we don't. In Cinthio's version, he is married. His potential wife is mentioned once in Shakespeare's version, but we don't really have any clue, and so we don't have any confirmation, that is to say, and so different study guides, different resources, different critics say different things with that. But to have this paragon of virtue, Desdemona, and then Bianca interacting together is interesting to see these two archetypes on stage at the same time. And interesting as well that all three of these couples are linked through the imagery and the symbol of the handkerchief. The handkerchief that is this example of female purity and chastity. It is a symbol of purity and chastity because it was a personal, intimate item that touched a woman's mouth and that she used on her body, so it was often used as a love token. Desdemona's is one given to her by Othello from his mother that she commissioned from a kind of witch-like figure who cast spells on it. It was woven supposedly with charms to do with virgins in them, so to ensure that this husband, her husband and Othello's father, was always faithful. It's white, another idea linked fundamentally with purity and moral goodness, which we will look at more critically when we think about colour theory and race. And it's decorated with strawberries. So at this time, a A concept called a virginity test was often used. So when particularly upper class people like kings and queens got married, they would have the marriage feast, celebration, etc. And then everyone would go into the marital bedroom. The couple would go into the bed, draw the curtains, and have sex, and everyone else would be in the room as well in order to witness the fact that the wife was a virgin. And they proved this by having the sheets checked for spots of blood, i.e. the breaking of the hymen in the marital bed. These sheets or linens were often hung out of windows or framed or held out on balconies to confirm that this wife was virginal before her marriage, because that was kind of the deal in this contract, that she would be exclusively used and the property of her husband. And I use huge quotations when I say that, obviously. Such that we have evidence of these. A lot of these were kind of preserved over time because this was part of the transaction of the marriage. If the woman did not bleed, either she was not a virgin or she just didn't, as it's scientifically now proved that not everyone does, that the marriage would be considered null and void. So it would be considered it doesn't count because they had violated this kind of contract of exchange of the woman from father to husband. So the fact that Desdemona's handkerchief, this white cloth with red strawberries on it, is an indicator of her virtue. And Karen Newman, very famous critic, talks a lot about the handkerchief and about Desdemona's role with it. It was viewed at the time that her giving a handkerchief to someone else would have been in proof of adultery. And the fact that this idea, literal manifestation of virginity and loss thereof, is being handed from couple to couple and appears on stage visually across the play, is really important in that it links these three together. Othello and Desdemona, given as a love token and lost, but used as the ocular proof to prove that Desdemona is being adulterous. Iago and Emilia. Iago asks Emilia to replicate it, asks her to steal it for him. And they use it, this married couple. Iago absolutely plants it on purpose in Cassio's room in order to show that he is adulterous with Desdemona. And then Cassio asks Bianca to copy the handkerchief as well, and she thinks it is proof that, as she found it in his room, that he has other lovers that are not her, and thus he's being unfaithful to her. Obviously, Bianca is not a virgin, so there's this kind of playful but also really serious elements to the handkerchief as it negotiates between these three couples. Let's take a look at 3 ideas to do with femininity in the play. So, first of all, we have Othello and Cassio as well calling Desdemona divine Desdemona. What does this mean for us? This is linked to God, right? This is linked to immortality. This is linked to someone being superhuman. But we're not thinking about her as God as in God as a woman, right? We're thinking about her as the embodiment of a Madonna. So what does that mean? Chaste, pure, perfect, kind of untouched. Sanctified in a way. saint-like. And passive as well, right? This idea of her being idealized here. But that's harmful, right? If someone's idealized or superhuman or godlike, they're not viewed as human. So if Desdemona fails to be perfect at any one moment, then this is something she's destined to fail. Or she's fated to fail as well. If we're thinking about fate, there's a potential theme here as well. Interesting as well, we've got this alliteration here, this divine Desdemona, that really highlights and emphasizes this as a epithet or a nickname. And it shows she's really reduced to this one idea, isn't she? So she is kind of confined by these expectations. She fulfills them, which is perhaps why her descent is so severe in Othello's eyes and in Brabantio's eyes as well, as he views her as his perfect child, and then he rejects her and disowns her in the same scene. So there's this idea here of divine Desdemona. She's idealized, she's put on a pedestal, she's worshipped. Does Othello really love her? Seems like it. But it's hard to say if he likes her or the idea of her, right? Because what is she? She's powerful. In this Madonna-esque figure, in this godlike thing, this is her only power. That's her only value in society. So if she loses that, she's nothing. And we can see that because she immediately loses her father and then subsequently loses Othello, who, from calling her divine Desdemona, etc., and an angel, she's then, I'll chop her to messes, I'll tear her to pieces, calling her a strumpet and a whore, etc. He neglects even to use her name at certain points. So she's this passive element. Her being transgressive then is really dangerous. Interestingly as well, though, Othello says, I'll do this in a different colour so as not to blind you with red pen. She wished she had not heard it, yet she wished that heaven had made her such a man. Interesting here. This is Othello talking about why Desdemona fell in love with him. And it was to do with his naval adventures. It was to do with his stories. Stephen, you said basically Othello is like a fallen angel. Yeah, kind of. And interestingly, in the final scene, Emilia says that she the more angel, and you the blacker devil. So there's this kind of chiasmus and juxtaposition and tension between her whiteness, his darkness, as in Brabantio's eyes, certainly it was Othello who dragged her from this pedestal and dragged her down to sin. In Othello's eyes, he doesn't think that as such, but he does think of her as contaminated as soon as this doubt of her faithfulness is come to light. Absolutely. these idea of his naval adventures being why she fell in love with him. She wished she'd not heard it. First of all, this idea that he was talking about her pitying him. So this shows her character, right? She's compassionate. She's caring. She's kind of listening. So she's still in this passionate, like loving, passive role. Because she's not talking about or going on the adventures herself. She's just listening. But she wished that heaven, this yet is interesting, right? There's this wrinkle to Desdemona's character. She wished that heaven had made her such a man. So she wished that she could be like Othello. Why is this surprising? This is Lady Macbeth-esque, isn't it? Like, unsex me here, strip off the masculinity or the limitations of femininity. Sorry, I missed a syllable there. Femininity. So these limitations of femininity that she is seeking to cast off. She seems rebellious here. She seems adventurous. She wants to be a man who can go off and have adventures. So perhaps here we're even revealing her potential for corruption. And I say corruption. Or transgression here. Because she wants not to be this quiet, passive love interest at home. She wants to go on the adventure herself as well. That says transgressive just above me. And she wants to be alongside Othello on these adventures. That's why she goes to Cyprus. She begs to go to Cyprus. And Othello says no. He tries to have her stay at her father's house, and Desdemona begs the Duke to allow her to go. And she does. Othello puts her on a different boat. So interesting here, right? She wants to go on the adventure. And for her to go to Cyprus, again, is transgressive, because remember, this is this wild place where people are not themselves, and that barbarism and lack of Christianity appears. And then we have this idea of her potential to deceive. Not just potential for transgression, but potential to deceive. In marrying you. And she deceived her father. This is supposed to be kind of her unquestioned authority. And Desdemona does this hugely transgressive thing by running away in secret, marrying Othello, and engaging in this interracial relationship that everyone views in their society as terrible. Coleridge describes it as insupportable, unthinkable. So for her to, this is Coleridge's quote, unthinkable. for her to transgress so severely in the beginning, it's interesting that Iago plants this seed in Othello's mind. Because Othello doesn't believe it at first, and then as soon as he sees some potential suggestion, he's willing to believe it. And this links to these ideas of physiognomy as well. That she can look so innocent and pure, etc., and have all of this underlying transgression going on with her. Now let's think about masculinity. So men of Jacobean England were defined by their reputation. Women helped to define this reputation as their behaviour reflected on their husband's control of the household. Thus, there was an obsession with women's chastity that engendered anxiety and violence within men. Masculine spheres of influence included the battlefield, the courtroom, and the public sphere. So we've seen that these are the places of setting in Othello. Indeed, Othello is the most eloquent when speaking in front of a crowd, much more so than when speaking in an intimate setting with Desdemona alone, or Iago about personal matters. Indeed, Emilia and Desdemona's presence in the masculine sphere of Cyprus, the rough boundary between civilization and uncivilized chaos, really does kind of throw the chaos into the mix and already seemingly tarnishes their reputation, because all of the interactions in Cyprus are kind of higher key and responded to with much less control and much more normal behaviour. And then cuckoldry, being a cuckold, describes a wife's infidelity towards her husband, and that's specifically one way. There was no similar word for a husband's infidelity towards his wife. The popular image of a horned man was particularly popular on Jacobean stages. The many explanations exist about the horns themselves. One is that a horned creature can't see their own horns, just as a cuckolded man is usually unaware of his wife's infidelities, even if everyone else knows. There are several other descriptions of how that came to be. It's also this idea of the weaker sex. Men were immediately distrustful of women's ability to control themselves sexually and morally. The damage cuckolding would do to a man's reputation would be severe, and it justified violence against women. It justified it. So it was allowed to be violent against a woman who had cuckolded you. So what does this tell us about gender expectations? What does this tell us about gender expectations? What does this tell us? They were certainly rigid. It seems like they were extremely rigid. They were very kind of volatile. The littlest thing could affect someone's reputation and thus have consequences both for the man and the woman in the relationship. They were very unbalanced. It creates a real sense of a power dynamic in these relationships. But it's also interesting, the power dynamic also works the other way, right? A woman kind of controls a man's reputation in a way, whereas they're dependent on a woman for their reputation. So thus, again, a woman is transactional again, in that she is used to prop up the reputation of a man. And then let's take a look at what this looks like for masculinity in the play. Othello says, "I will chop her into messes, cuckold me." This is the same wife he was calling divine Desdemona and talking about how much he loved in the previous one. I will chop her into messes. Okay, here we are. Chop her, this idea of violent imagery. And into messes, this idea of destruction. But this being reactive to this, cuckolding him. This determined language as well. I will as Othello says as well, to doubt is to know, essentially. I'm paraphrasing. But he says that as soon as you're in doubt, your doubt's confirmed. It's enough to doubt, in other words. So really, once this train of doubt happens, that's enough. To destroy not only his reputation, but also their marriage. And look at what Cassio says as well. Cassio, who has just been embarrassed and stripped of his title because Iago gets him drunk and he accidentally wounds the ex-governor of Cyprus, Montano. Cassio says, reputation, reputation, reputation. Oh, I have lost my reputation. I have lost the immortal part of myself, and what remains is bestial, or beast-like, in other words. So first of all, take a look how many times this repetition centers the reputation as a focal point. He says, I have lost the immortal part of myself. What remains is bestial. So now we can understand slightly more the context of why Othello and Brabantio go so completely transformed by anger when they find out or think they know what Desdemona has done, because they have lost the immortal part of themselves. This is something to do with their souls, right? Their idea of their preservation. The part of them that's divine, if it's immortal. What remains is bestial, beast-like. So they've become dehumanized. They are inferior. It's like they've moved away from God, or devolved in a way. And it shows this juxtaposition, this kind of parallelism between bestiality and immortality. That reputation is the human, or the more than human, and this is the animal version of people. And this is the transition that happens with Othello, right? He goes from immortal, this well-respected, loved general, to something bestial. Does Iago know this? Absolutely. He's also in this society, right? He knows what will happen if someone loses their reputation. He knows what Othello is like. He cares about it, which makes sense because Othello, the only thing that he has is his reputation, right? Otherwise, he is just the Moor of Venice, the black man and the Moor who has taken the transgressive step of attempting to marry the elite of Venice, Desdemona. It's only his reputation that saves him. And as Othello said, to be once in doubt is once to be resolved. This is the quote I paraphrased earlier. So it shows how little masculinity depended on how fragile reputation is. And also confirms to be once in doubt, to be once resolved. What is this resolution? Revenge, right? Destruction of the thing that destroyed their reputation, i.e. Desdemona. It's not just Cassio, who is his best friend, who betrayed him, but Desdemona, his wife, who is part and parcel of how he maintains status in society. And interestingly, Adrienne Rich is a pretty famous feminist critic who wrote that the woman's body is the terrain on which the patriarchy is erected. What does this mean? This means that in order for the patriarchy to be built, the woman's body needs to be the foundation. So that means that positions women as the inferior, and women needing to be inferior and submissive in order for men to be superior in this hierarchy of patriarchal society. This also links to this idea of sacrifice, right? That women are sacrificed for the preservation of patriarchy and all that entails. And we could see this, right? Othello sacrifices Desdemona for his reputation. Iago sacrifices Emilia in order to preserve his lie. If reputation is fundamental to masculinity, then we're thinking of women being killed to preserve reputation as the logic of patriarchy. If we're looking this way, we're thinking about feminist theory, which is looking at the inclusion and presentation of women and other genders in text. So, do they appear in these texts? And if so, how? Are they only as housewives and as mothers? Are they independent? Do they have agency at all? Are they silent? Why? If so, why not? If so. And they're particularly attuned to the historical and socio-political systems of oppression and institutional inequalities in patriarchal societies. So feminist lens or feminist theory accepts that patriarchy others women, patriarchy makes women inferior in society, and that women are defined in a patriarchy by what they are not. So the experience as women in a patriarchy is that they are not men, so that thus they are not powerful. They are very much like we talked about with the defining of Europe by its others. Patriarchy does the same thing for femininity, in that it is the Orientalist view of a place that otherwise would be its own idea. It's not its own idea, it's dependent in patriarchy. So how does this appear here? How can we think about gender? There's lots of different ways we could think about this. One of this is that women are transactional. Women are used in order to support reputation, in order to gain power by men. Another idea we could think about is that women are idealized as paragons of virtue. But if they transgress they are dehumanized, etc. Or fallen, if we're thinking about that biblical language again. We could also think of this as men being defined by their reputation. And then we could fit this idea of women being transactional underneath this as thinking about one of the ways that men preserve their reputation is by using women, either marrying them and gaining power, controlling them and gaining power, or losing them and losing power, and thus sacrificing them in order to preserve it. We could think of men as defined by their reputation. We could think of them when their power and control is threatened. violence is justified. And we can also think about as a separate idea the power dynamic between them as imbalanced. But really any of these ideas here could be their own kind of paragraph of exploring, because there is so much of all of this in Othello. Now let's think about race. So race within Jacobean England, and feel free to put in the chat if you have any thoughts to talk about, but if not, we'll move on. So race in Jacobean England was complex. To start with, anxieties developed by biblical imagery led people to associate blackness with evil and devilry. It's widely believed that, as I said, Queen Elizabeth I signed these 2 edicts in response to fears that Moors would take the jobs of English people. That's been recently challenged, especially as Elizabeth's own household included several black servants, we imagine were probably enslaved, or gifts from other monarchs, which would then be de facto slavery anyway. The Queen entertained diplomats from Morocco, we know that as well. Despite this, stereotypes and prejudice of black and African people spread in England, possibly stemming from accounts of conquest during the Age of Discovery. So all of these accounts coming back from colonizers, writing about the people that they had discovered or encountered in their journeys, as well as biblical teachings of one of Noah's sons, Noah from Noah's Ark, Ham, who is believed to be the ancestor of all African people. And Ham was punished and sentenced to suffering during his lifetime and the lifetime of his descendants. He was kind of the evil son of Noah's in the Bible, and the Jacobean's version of the Bible, and thus that spread as kind of spiritual truth. Then we're thinking about miscegenation. So miscegenation is interracial marriages and sexual relationships between black and white people. As sex between marriage was viewed as a process for reproduction, the concept of mixed race children was often viewed as a type of corruption of the white race. So we're thinking about whiteness, blackness, purity, devilry. We can see a lot of black and white imagery in Othello as well. Mixed race children consequently occupied a third space, as shown in the quotation below. This is David Olusoga's amazing Black and British. Thinkers, chroniclers, and philosophers of the 16th century asked, why were Africans black? Was the blackness of Africans temporary or permanent, congenital and inherited? What about children born to interracial couples? Would they be black, white, or some other hue? So literally this dehumanization of children of interracial marriages or couplings, and thinking about race as this kind of passing on, as something that could be passed on and that didn't mix within and continue lines, but rather disrupted inheritance. Olusoga continues, this idea of the race doesn't mean to Shakespeare and his contemporaries what it means to us. It had a tendency to shift its meaning over time, but it overlapped with, and this is important, notions of purity and pedigree. What Elizabethans and early Stuarts did understand were ideas surrounding skin colour. Okay. So skin colour. Shakespeare's audience had a fascination with human blackness that was influenced by older medieval ideas about the meanings of the colour black and its symbolic relationship with its opposite, white. Good. So this idea of the relationship between these two seeming opposites. Blackness in the 16th and early 17th centuries was associated with the night, supernatural, and the diabolical. The devil was depicted as black in innumerable medieval paintings and continued to be portrayed as such in Elizabethan and Stuart woodcuts. To call someone black in Shakespeare's England was to insult them, not by any linkage with race, but because the colour itself was pregnant with negative symbolism. Whiteness, by contrast, was the marker of purity, virginity, and even divinity, as we can see through the quotation of Desdemona. Concepts that were never more loaded with meaning than in the years when a virgin queen who whitened her skin with lead-based makeup ruled England, were Africans imbued with the negative traits associated with the colour black. So if we're thinking about blackness and race and the view of ideas about race, we can think about this as a post-colonial lens, which is a lens presenting how colonizers and colonized people were treated and presented in literature, so very similar to feminist lens in that idea, as well as the lasting effects of colonialism, imperialism, and empire on identity, power dynamics, and presentation. So if we're thinking about these ideas of colonizers and colonized people as influencing and engaging with these ideas in Othello, then we can use those as our ideas as well and look at the text that way. So Iago says, I hate them all. Such a clear racist comment, right? He doesn't say he hates Othello, he hates the Moor. So what does this mean? This means he hates his identity, right? He hates what he is or who he is. And this goes to show this kind of dehumanizing language that carries through discussions about Othello. Look at what Iago says when he is telling Brabantio about the marriage. Zounds, sir, you're robbed. Interesting, this idea of Desdemona being something that could be robbed. This idea of objectification with her. She's a possession of his to be taken. For shame, put on your gown. Your heart is burst. You've lost half your soul. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. Tupping is the kind of farmer's language of the time to talk about animal breeding. So not only is this graphic sexual imagery, but this is also talking about Othello and Desdemona being animals. So this idea of zoomorphism here. And of their relationship being one that is animalistic and bestial rather than human at all. And it reduces both of them to these animal roles. And this idea of an old black ram, very racialized here. And this idea of this kind of forceful animalistic breeding rather than any kind of love or relationship or marriage being really racialized in its description in this idea of blackness tupping or covering whiteness and kind of transmitting blackness to whiteness here. Arise, arise, awake the snorting citizens with the bell, or else the devil will make a grandsire of you. So the devil will make a grandfather of you. In other words, you will have children that are half devil and half human. This really does speak to this idea of the dehumanization of Othello. But it also does attack Desdemona as well. It's dehumanizing and offensive language for her as well, because it speaks of her as this kind of object within these sexual spaces, as something that's violated, as something that's passive, as something that's contaminated or damaged in some way, that's really horrible and both, as Stephen said, misogynistic as well as racist here. Then we have this idea of Brabantio when he's speaking to Othello in the court, damned as thou art, thou hast enchanted her. So this idea that he can't fathom that she would love him at all. So there has to be some kind of devilry or witchcraft here. For I'll refer me to all things of sense. If she in chains of magic were not bound, whether a maid so tender, fair, and happy, so opposite to marriage that she shunned the wealthy curled darlings of our nation, so uninterested in marriage that she shunned all of the rich elite darlings or beloved suitors of Venice, would have ever to incur a general mock, so to incur or cause the mockery of society. So she would never risk this societal damage done to her and run from her guardage, from her protective place. But it almost gives this idea of a cell, right? From her guardage to the sooty bosom of a thing as thou, to fear, not to delight. This idea of sootiness being something that's contaminating, that's staining. That can be passed by contact from one to the other. Like if you get ash or soot on your hands and then touch something white, it's going to damage it by leaving a mark on it. This links to this idea of the handkerchief, right? And this idea of purity versus staining. This sooty bosom of a thing, such a thing as thou. So two things here. Again, the referential strategies. Especially in contrast to something like our nation versus a thing as thou, really does set this juxtaposition between the two, right? Venice versus Othello as the outsider. And then thou, even though thou sounds fancier than you to us, it was actually the more informal way of referring to someone, so more the way talking down to someone. So this establishes a power dynamic in which Brabantio views himself as higher up than Othello. And he suggests that it's something to fear, not to delight. So again, this idea of juxtaposition here. He thinks that Desdemona will fear Othello as some kind of devil and couldn't possibly delight in his appearance, because if he's black in Brabantio's eyes, he's ugly and he's evil. So why would she, this beautiful, tender, fair being a word linked to whiteness and lightness, for her to be linked to something sooty that would contaminate her? In his mind, certainly not. And we can see this as well with what Othello says later on, that this affects him, because he says, my name, that was as fresh as Diana's visage, as fresh as Diana, the goddess. The goddess's face, we're thinking immediately of whiteness. If we're thinking of Aphrodite's face, goddess of love, is now begrimed, so grimy and black as mine own face. So again, we have this juxtaposition, right? His name being spotless and now being stained and contaminated and dirty. This idea of dirtiness is linked very much to this idea of virginity and purity. And Othello also says, haply for I am black, she's gone. It's like, because I am black, she's gone. Because I don't have those things that all of these other wealthy curled darlings of our nations have. Because I'm black instead, she's gone. So this is cause and effect here. And speaks to his own internalized racism. That he views her cheating on him as something that was bound to happen because he's black. Right? F.R. Leavis, famous critic, says Othello is black and his blackness connotes ugliness, treachery, lust, bestiality, and the demonic. This poisonous image of the black man, as we shall see, later informs Othello's judgment of himself. Although Iago's notorious artistry is usually linked to his capacity to shape a plot, it extends as well to characterization. For the Othello he in many ways creates comes to see himself as his own stereotype. And this is the real tragedy, right? At the beginning, Othello is happy and loved and to a certain extent accepted in Venice because he's welcomed into the house of Brabantio. He's friends with the Duke. He's the successful general of the Venetian military, but he descends. So from this general to his own stereotype. So everything that Brabantio says about him, that he's a monster, that he's evil, that he's tricked Desdemona, that he's devilish, he then becomes. He becomes the stereotypes that people enforce on him, this idea of stereotype threat. And we covered in our last lesson this idea of setting, Venice and Cyprus being these two settings, but across the play, this actually has racialized ideas to it as well. So Orientalism, which I've mentioned a couple of times already. This term coined and popularized by anthropologist Edward Said in his 1978 text to describe how Western writers and cultures have historically represented countries in the Middle East and Asia. Said described that this representation is built on stereotypes that center on the East as the contrasting other to the supposedly civilized, rational, modern and Christian West. So these are two quotes from Said's text. Not for nothing did Islam come to symbolize terror, devastation, the demonic, hordes or hated barbarians. For Europe, Islam was a lasting trauma. Until the end of the 17th century, so way after Shakespeare's death and this publication at the beginning of the 17th century, the Ottoman peril lurked alongside Europe to represent for the whole of Christian civilization a constant danger. And in time, European civilization incorporated that peril and its law, its great events, figures, virtues and vices as something woven into the fabric of life. So this idea of the normalization of Islamophobia and this idea of barbarism as normalized in society and thus defined as something completely other. And then as well, the two aspects of the Orient that set it off from the West in this pair of plays will remain essential motifs of European imaginative geography. A line is drawn between two continents. Europe is powerful and articulate. Asia, and by this Said means both Middle East and Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia. Asia is defeated and distanced. Secondly, there is this motif of the Orient as insinuating danger. So this is the Venetians' view of Othello. Dangerous, distance, defeated, whereas they are powerful and articulate. Same here with terror, devastation, demonic, hordes, hated barbarians, trauma. The whole of Christian civilization versus danger, constant danger. Its peril and its law versus this European civilization. How does this apply to Othello? This applies because Othello then embodies all of these Orientalist views, and the rest of Venice defines themselves by what they are not. So Iago, Cassio, Rodrigo, Brabantio define and negotiate their masculinity and their identities against Othello's. Interestingly as well, as the play goes on, there's this anxiety about the marital bedroom. There's this anxiety about what is going to happen if they actually have sex. let's look at across the play what happens. Oh, treason of the blood. This is what Brabantio says when he finds out Desdemona has left. Your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. Another graphic description of sex, right? But again, linking it to this idea of bestiality. An old black ram is tapping your white ewe. The gross clasps of a lascivious Moor. Lascivious means sexually charged and to a certain extent deviant. And this gross clasp, so the terrible and horrible physicality of holding this lascivious Moor. Notice no one is just using Othello's name to describe this, right? Run from her guardage to the city bosom of such a thing as thou, and then the Moor angel she, and you the blacker devil. And as Kin and Ryan says, another critic, Othello and Desdemona have made a mockery of the principles of social, sexual, and racial hierarchy on which Iago's very identity and sense of self-worth depend on. So perhaps it's his racism that forces him, rather than any kind of jealousy or anger about a promotion, to engage with and feel like he ought to and needs to destroy Othello for attempting to rise in society and marry Desdemona. And we can see this kind of scope of the play, the setting, goes from Venice to Cyprus, and then gets closer and closer to the marital bedroom. Everyone is worried about this. There are so many different interactions that interrupt a potential moment when they could consummate the marriage, or when we are talking about the product of that consummation, i.e. sex and children as a result of this marriage. Such so that the audience would also be engaged in this narrative. Based on the racial anxieties of the Jacobean era, could Othello and Desdemona and their marriage have survived the play? Is this fated because they dared to commit this treason of the blood, this betrayal of society's expectations? Would they have been able to escape this play, be married and live happily ever after, have children as people were expected to do in marriage, and be able to live happily ever after? I would argue not. I would say that this would be really difficult for a Jacobean audience to see, which is possibly why Shakespeare decides to interrupt them every time they have this potential to be sort of loving and or physically intimate, that Jacobeans wouldn't have been able to manage that and would have rejected that on stage, or even more of a suggestion of it as happening. That kind of uncertainty whether it actually ever happens is possibly to assuage the Jacobean mind. That's for them it's unthinkable, and for Coleridge many years later to also think that that's unthinkable. So if we're thinking about how race appears in the play, we could do an entire paragraph on this idea of whiteness, right? Whiteness as purity, whiteness as innocence, whiteness as this kind of emblem of femininity. And then separately from that, we could think about blackness and how blackness is portrayed. As something, as Stephen says, like a fallen angel, this idea of devilry, racism, this post-colonial lens linking it to anxieties of the time. And similarly in argument one, we could talk about a feminist lens of what this means for women and the Madonna whore dichotomy. I'm going to add that now. And then in the third, this idea of miscegenation and setting. We could talk about this criticism of Alusoga. We could talk about the marital bedroom. we could talk about this graphic sexual imagery. And this idea of contamination and staining. And even the internalized racism of Othello that perhaps in some ways influences his actions. Internalized racism. From Othello. Internalized racism. And this is our final idea here. Shakespeare's dramas, this is according to Martin Orkin, show that nobility and valour, like depravity and cowardice, are not the monopoly of any colour. So all of these spans of the human condition, both the good and the bad, are not the monopoly, are not just belonging to one colour or one race. Do we reckon at this point that Shakespeare is reinforcing or subverting Jacobean expectations of race and gender by presenting Desdemona, Emilia, Bianca, Othello, Brabantio, Iago, Roderigo, Cassio in these lights? What do you think? Reinforcing or subverting, and why? Though looking at the time, this might be our final thought. So take a moment to put into the chat, and your homework in the next few minutes should become available. There is a worked solution for you as well to explain all of the answers in more detail. Our next lesson will be on Wednesday, and we will be talking about more to do with Othello, getting into more of the quotations and talking about different patterns of analysis as well, as the idea of tragedy as a genre and how Shakespeare's tragedy is influenced by Greek tragedies, as well as the perception of Aristotle's precept about tragedy, etc. So that's all for now. I will leave you to get on with the rest of your Friday. Thank you very much for your attention, and your homework should be available soon. I'll see you on Wednesday. Bye.